This is where the big boys play, huh? We ain't here to play.
At the total combined weight. At the total combined weight of 589 pounds.
Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, at well over 500 pounds, this is where the big boys play.
Welcome to the show, everybody. You are listening to At a Combined Weight. This is where the big boys play because we're both big boys. Thanks for clicking the link that brought you here on SoundCloud, YouTube as well. I am your host, Charlie Dudley, with my co-host, Robert McElroy. How you doing, Rob?
I'm doing well. I'll give you one of these that Larry Zbyszko does at the, when Shivani throws to him. Of course, none of our listeners can hear that. Yes, we are at a combined weight, and we are both pretty large. It's funny. You and I can't quite get away from this. We're not unlike aging wrestlers who don't know when to hang up the boots.
Oh, yeah. You started back in our Weagle days at Auburn, and then,
that's right.
Kind of took a hiatus or retired and came back. We're like Terry Funk. We just keep coming back for more, or Mick Foley, and get a cheap pop every now and then.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I keep coming back for. I don't think, I think in some capacity we'll always come back to something like this. The more things change, the more they stay the same. It started with handoffs and headlocks, like you said, Weagle 91.1, Auburn student-operated station. You went on to do a lot of great stuff at Weagle, actually. Cover 2 was one of them. You brought me into the fold. That became a podcast back in 2010, and that was a lot of fun. Here we are, except now it's exclusively 100% wrestling, and honestly, that's what I prefer.
Yeah, and
that's better.
This is At a Combined Weight, how it differs from other podcasts that we've had before. If you are a listener that has come with us, throughout the years, it's going to be a retrospective look at Nitro because it's been 20 years since the NWO invasion took place, May 27th, 1996. Scott Hall shows up on Monday Night Nitro, and I was 11. I would turn 12 in August of that year. Robert, you were 10? Had just turned 10?
Yeah, I was 10 years old. I was, splitting time between, I was at my mother's house, about a week. And then I would go to my dad's for another week. They had split up. They were good and divorced by that time. And so, really, like
getting into like personal lives. And
I don't mean to pull.
I come from a broken home.
I don't want to pull a Herb on you here and, get all emotional on you and transition into bicentennial year. Anyway, right. No, but it was a very big part of my life. It was important. I think there's a lot to be said about escapism, and if there's something happening in your life that is tough to go through, we turn to entertainment, and that's why people in entertainment are important. That's why people in the wrestling business, what they do is extremely important. I needed that as a kid, and it was my favorite thing in the world, from WCW Monday Nitro being glued to the television to the action figures. It was my go-to when Mother would threaten to punish me with something. The ultimate punishment threat was no Nitro. Okay, all right, no Nitro, and
yeah.
I wasn't about to have no Nitro in my life, so I would get my shit together.
Yeah, that's kind of the same for me. I wasn't a huge WCW fan until Nitro kind of made its introduction into my life, because I was a WWF guy, all through the late 80s. My first memories are you waking up on Sunday morning and watching All-American Wrestling and then catching some primetime wrestling. USA, it would come on after Murder, She Wrote, and I hated that show because it would seem like the last 10 to 15 minutes would last a century. 4, 5, 6, late 80s, early 90s, big Hogan, Warrior era, and that kind of time period to me. I was a big WWF fan, but, as we were talking, before we started recording, yesterday and today, for me, my introduction to Nitro was just watching a WCW Saturday Night, and I saw that Scott Hall showed up at a Nitro, and so I was like, well, why is Razor Ramon on WCW? I'd just seen him, fairly recently, and so I tuned in, because this was like pre-Bash at the Beach, and we'll talk about that as we go along, but this was like pre-Bash at the Beach, and they kind of showed how the NWO had infiltrated their programming and, threatened them, and they were bringing their third guy in, and WCW's third guy had already, they already had their team set, and we'll talk about that more as we go. But, the WWF guys being on WCW is what drew me to WCW, which is exactly what I think Bischoff and the powers that be that created the NWO angle wanted. They wanted to get that fan like I was that was, predominantly WWF, and I rarely, if ever, watched WCW unless it was like nothing else on, or, I caught like a Clash of the Champions.
WCW, I latched onto it pretty early prior to the Invasion storyline and what we would learn would be the NWO. I guess my early days of wrestling and falling in love with it, I would go to the local video store. Back then they were 100% relevant, and they were very locally owned, and there were two in town, and there was one in particular. Of course, it's long since closed. Went belly up a long time ago, as did every video store. Now it's a Chinese restaurant.
Nice.
But I could go into the section of this Chinese restaurant where these wrestling videos were. They would have all the pay-per-views from Royal Rumble to WrestleMania, and I would rent them. God willing, my parents would let me, and I would watch them. And so my WWF was, I was time shifting back in the day. Of course, it wasn't with DVR; it was with videos I would go rent.
Right.
And of course, there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell of my parents ever allowing me to buy a pay-per-view. In fact, the first time I'd watch a pay-per-view was at your condo at Auburn. That was the first. My parents were letting me.
And I was in college in 2007, around there.
2007. I remember walking over there like, I'm about to go finally watch my first wrestling pay-per-view. This is incredible. So going back to the early 90s, that was how I fell in love with WWF. I very rarely watched it live, but WCW, and I don't know if this was because you and I both grew up either in or around Birmingham, but the WCW being a Southern product, I consumed that. I guess my first experience consuming live wrestling was WCW. I remember the old set. You and I talked about this the other day, the old soundstage in Orlando with those big steel-looking doors that would open up and the smoke. And every wrestler basically had the same entrance.
Right, they did. Yeah, they would just kind of – they were like the sliding doors.
Exactly.
They were like French doors, but they slid to either side. And yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that set vividly. The ring could spin around in a circle and all that whole deal. I think they did that at like the beginning of the program. I seem to remember that kind of vividly from watching, a Saturday night here and there. Yeah, I think coming from the South, us both being born and raised in and around the metro area, Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham's 2 hours away from Atlanta. Right. And WCW's based out of Atlanta. Big Southern promotion, announcers that sounded like us, Southern, Jim Ross in the early days of WCW. And that's my first kind of exposure to Jim Ross was also my first exposure to Mick Foley as Cactus Jack, Vader, that kind of thing. But you coming from Columbiana, it's a smaller town outside of Birmingham. How many people live in Columbiana?
I think today, somewhere around 6,000 minimum, 8 to 10,000. No Columbiana listeners kill me for getting it all wrong, but like 10,000 today.
Yeah, it's pretty small.
Time, pretty small.
I was closer to the city. Birmingham proper, like the downtown area, was about 5 minutes from where I grew up, over in Huffman and Roebuck. And, as we moved, Trustful, Center Point, like 10, 15 minutes from town. So we're like right on the edge of the suburbs. And for you, Birmingham was like an hour, 45 minutes away? like Birmingham.
Yeah, I mean, where you and I were. Yeah, if you were to, 45 minutes solid to downtown.
Right.
But I remember the whole, it seemed like WCW would rebrand itself, and the set looked the way the Nitro set would look pretty much up until the end. I, too, was going, what is Razor Ramon doing entering a WCW ring from the stands? It was brilliant how they did it.
Right.
Of course, we'll get into it more as we discuss it.
Yeah, well, hey, let's go ahead and get into
it.
Let's start. We're going to start May 27, 1996. The reason we're starting here is because, not that the Nitros prior to this were unimportant for hundreds of thousands of people. This is where they became WCW fans, or in and around this time period. May 27, 1996. This was also the first 2-hour broadcast of Nitro, and what I did not remember, and you didn't either, apparently, is that they had two separate broadcast teams for Hour 1 and Hour 2. You had Tony Schiavone and Larry Sabisco doing Hour 1, Eric Bischoff and Bobby Heenan for Hour 2. Very interesting, and, Raw kind of did that same thing to where they would turn, Hour 1 was the one thing, and then Hour 2 was a completely different. That was for ratings, etc. An interesting way to do things, based on the formulaic way of doing things that we see today. Beat over the head with your 15-minute promo segment to start the show, setting up a main event.
That's true. I also like the approach. I think it's a neat way of doing things. It's funny that at the time, having a 2-hour wrestling telecast was such a huge deal. Whereas today, speaking of getting beat over the head, it's 3 hours. What television show do you know is 3 hours long? Raw is a 3-hour-long telecast, and the only thing I watch on TV that's 3 hours other than Raw is a football game, and sometimes that's including the overtime.
Yeah. One thing I thought about the other day, Sunday night, I watched Game of Thrones, and it's an hour on HBO Go, or if you watch it live on HBO. And if you look at it, the entire season of Game of Thrones is roughly 10 hours long. 10 hours.
Yeah.
You go through that much wrestling just on Raw in 3 1/3 weeks.
Yeah.
3 1/3 weeks.
No, it's ridiculous.
And once you add SmackDown to the live mix, you're going through 10 hours of live televised wrestling in 2 weeks. So this is the advent of the longer wrestling program, which is kind of why we started here. The show opens with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson against the American Males. Of course, the American Males, Buff Bagwell prior to his buff persona, Marcus Alexander Bagwell and Scotty Riggs. What stands out to you for this match?
I think what stands out the most to me about this match is that the first match of the entire telecast, and you have two of some of the greatest of all time, one of most people would put on their very cliche Mount Rushmore of wrestling. The first match out of the gate, and you have two Hall of Famers, one of which has 2 Hall of Fame rings as both an individual personality and as a member of the Horsemen. That's what stood out the most to me.
Right.
Was simply that. You have to go through, going back to how long Raw is, you got to go through an hour or 2.5 hours of Raw to see future Hall of Famers, if you see that.
Right. You're right. Yeah. What stood out to me initially is that Woman and Miss Elizabeth were wearing matching clothing. That stood out to me as being very amusing, as, the valets are wearing matching sequined outfits. I thought it was hilarious. The American Males, they're in a spot here where you think that they're kind of going to be jobbers if you first start watching. But, this is kind of a rise for the American Males. They had won the WCW Tag Team titles in 1995, and they only had an 8-day reign. They defeated Harlem Heat. But Marcus Alexander Bagwell, who goes on to become Buff, he and Scotty Riggs, they worked hard in this match.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it wasn't a bad match by any stretch.
This is the first time I had gone back and watched Nitro, so, over 20 years since I had seen this. And one thing that it immediately jumped back to me as one thing I did not really enjoy about Nitro broadcasts is they didn't really call the match that much, as so much as they pushed things that were happening later or plugging something that you needed to see later. Like Schiavone and Zbyszko spent most of the match plugging the Horsemen, Mongo McMichael, Kevin Green angle that was going to lead to a tag team match at Great American Bash.
I noticed the same thing. In fact, I took note. I thought it was funny. And I liked Larry Zbyszko back then, and I liked Tony Schiavone, and it was great to revisit all this now. But I really like the things that Zbyszko has to say. In hour one, he's the smartass. Hour two, Bobby Heenan would be that smartass. But Zbyszko's like, he takes on that role of burying the non-wrestling football guys who are going to step into a ring by saying, I guess he was burying Kevin Green. He's leaving Pittsburgh to go to some podunk team in North Carolina. At the time, the Panthers were a pretty new franchise. They hadn't been around long.
They were an expansion franchise. They'd been around for a cup of coffee, and it's kind of funny that they went back to the Super Bowl this year.
I know, yeah. It would be their first one. The first one, the second time they get their total. Right. I noticed in this match how Arn would prioritize. He would work that leg of I guess it was Marcus Bagwell, and he just kept working that leg. And Flair would come in and work that same leg, and they're cheating asses. Old school heel tactics. I thought that was great, and I thought it's something that I see missing a little bit today, and I thought, younger guys, take notes. This is how it's done.
Yeah, I mean, they're working the leg, working behind the ref's back. Woman rakes the eyes. That leads to Arn's DDT on Bagwell that ends up giving the Horsemen the win here. One thing I did love, and it kind of it feeds into Ric Flair's persona and the larger-than-life character, not the shell of a man that he is now on our television sets. Sending champagne to the announce team during the match was huge. I mean, at this point, they have the gimmick table set up with champagne, and it's a VIP table that's set up in the aisleway, that comes into play several times in this early build of Nitro. And they go and they send champagne to the announcers. Larry Zbyszko is able to sip some champagne with Tony Schiavone.
That was good stuff. I also took note of how close the VIP table was to the fans themselves. I mean, you could have easily reached over and gotten some cheese and some crackers and some grapes if you were, large and wanted a snack.
Right.
And wanted to get some champagne.
If you didn't want to walk all the way to the concession stand.
If you sat near the VIP table, you didn't have to go buy the overpriced hot dogs and shit.
Post-match Horseman promo, they cut a promo on Mongo McMichael, Kevin Green, obviously pushed the tag match that would happen at Great American Bash. Flair takes a shot at Macho Man because Macho Man had been banned from buildings because he was going psycho, because Elizabeth had left him and she was spending money from the divorce. And so his deal was that he was pushing the fact that, he was spending Macho's money and he took his woman. That same kind of Macho Flair back and forth with Miss Elizabeth in the middle that we had seen, or to me, that I had seen in their build to their WrestleMania 8 feud in WWF.
Yeah, and this wouldn't be the last time that they use Miss Elizabeth in a storyline.
Right.
They would come back to that much later, which I guess that'll be a show we do, and I don't know how many months down the line that'll be, but I remember specifically a very emotional Miss Elizabeth storyline that, me being the kind of fan that could just suspend the hell out of my belief, I bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
They did good stuff with her, so. And Ric Flair was so funny in his promo. It was, it harkened back to the early days of some of the promos that I like to go revisit here these days on YouTube. He was so funny. And then we get a segment just after that, Kevin Green and Mongo McMichael, of them working out. They would do a few of these, over the course of the 2 Nitros that you and I are going to preview, and they were pretty cheesy. These were good and cheesy.
Oh yeah, they're good and cheesy. It definitely rings true of the mid '90s. Is a good just cheese-tastic weightlifting session for Mongo and Kevin Green. And I thought that back then I thought it was kind of odd us being from Alabama, Kevin Green, a former Auburn standout. So a lot of people loved Kevin Green down here, because he played at Auburn, and then he went to become a star for the Steelers, and then he kind of moved south of the Mason-Dixon line again with the Panthers. So this was kind of it did a little crossover, which wrestling loves to do, the mainstream crossovers, and this was just the latest for WCW. But they pushed the hell out of this tag match. It was kind of their, I think that it was pushed more than any other storyline for the Great American Bash.
Yeah.
And in this, especially in this episode of Nitro, I think that the Horsemen, and the next one too, the Horsemen football angle was definitely pushed to the gills, getting you ready for Great American Bash.
I think there's a right and wrong way to use celebrities in a wrestling telecast and in wrestling, period. We've seen it done well. We've seen it done poorly. I thought
definitely.
While they did, like you say, and I agree that they pushed it more than anything going into Great American Bash, it was pretty well done. In spite of how cheesy these segments were, they did a good job with this, and I like it when celebrities are utilized in a correct way. I remember seeing in War Eagle Reader, they posted an article one day about how, I guess they teased it on Twitter or somewhere, about how, guess which former Auburn standout also had a brief career in wrestling. Of course, that's a link I'm going to click on all day.
Yeah, of course.
Of course, yeah, it was.
And
Kevin Green.
it's Kevin Green.
Yeah.
So, second match on the show, and this is where things get interesting as far as Nitro is concerned. We mentioned earlier in the show, and this is what initially brings me into the WCW fold. And it's a match, Steve Dahl versus the Mauler. The Mauler is, of course, Mike Enos. He was Blake Beverly of the Beverly Brothers. And to me, this is my thought process when Scott Hall shows up mid-match. And I see, because they showed this footage on every WCW television leading up to the Bash at the Beach ad nauseum, it seemed. And, I'm like, well, why is one of the Beverly Brothers dressed up in like leather cowboy gear? Because, the Beverly Brothers had the Genius as their manager, and they were dressed in like purple and silver, and they had these capes, and they were both blonde and tanned, and now Mike Enos is a badass cowboy wearing chaps with his wrestling gear. And so I said, why is Razor Ramon coming down the crowd? And then he gets in the ring and everybody vacates. And, at 11, you're thinking like, why is he there? But you're also thinking, they wouldn't have let him do this to a certain point if it wasn't. And they did a good job of selling it, I think.
Oh, yeah.
That he wasn't supposed to be there. He comes in the ring and says, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. Calls Bischoff a Ken doll. Tell me about your thoughts on this.
It's one of my favorite moments in wrestling ever. Not to get all hyperbolic on you and get all JBL. It's just the greatest thing ever, Michael. No.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that this was one of the most significant moments that happened in wrestling, maybe in my lifetime. I think it would change the course, because without this single act, you don't have an Invasion, you don't have an NWO. Without an NWO, I don't know how much of a Monday Night War you have. Without a Monday Night War, I don't know how much of an Attitude Era you have. So it changed wrestling.
Oh, yeah, it's the first domino, for sure.
Oh, my God, yeah. For the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, 15 years. I've been around for 30 of those years. And so for 15 years, it would change the course of wrestling. You could even say 20 years later, it is what it is today because of it, perhaps. I mean, if we're talking dominoes.
Yeah.
I remember being just, I had a lot of emotions going on, Charles. I was the kind of fan that could hardcore suspend my belief. Hard to an extent that was, probably a little weird for some people. I had at least one really good friend growing up tell me, said, "Man, you take this stuff too seriously." To an extent, he was right.
It's still real to me, damn it.
Right. So, I do remember thinking, like a lot of other people were, what is Razor Ramon doing on a WCW telecast? He's not supposed to be here. What is he talking about? An invasion, and it would just grow and grow. It was a really, really neat deal. It was fun to watch it happen the other day as I watched the full telecast.
Yeah, what got me is I'd forgotten, I guess, kind of how early in the show it took place. You know,
true.
Like you brought up the fact that Nitro kind of busts out of the gate early with the Horsemen being in the first match of the show, and then lo and behold, within the first half hour or so, you've got Scott Hall showing up.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's in the era of live wrestling. If this was done today, Twitter would blow up. If it wasn't broken prior to this, Twitter would blow up. Cell phones would be like, "Hey, Scott Hall's on Nitro," or "Razor Ramon is on Nitro. You need to flip over." And that's kind of what's missing from today's wrestling, is that you need to see this now kind of aspect.
I agree.
For me, and I loved that Scott Hall was wearing a Canadian tuxedo, all denim, wearing jeans and a blue jean vest. I mean, he's
dude. I wore a blue jean vest to school one time. And all I needed was a friend of mine to say, "Dude, you need to give your mom back her blue jean vest." I was so pissed off. That's
Scott
all I
Hall
needed. I never wore that damn thing again. I swear.
Scott Hall definitely didn't look like your mom or anybody else's mom at the time.
No.
Looking back, it's so mid-90s style. He looked cool. He was there meant business.
It was well thought out.
Yeah,
sorry.
It
was well thought out. You had to have him come out in street clothes and just have him choose the street clothes. Him coming out in Razor Ramon gear would have been Lawsuit City, for instance.
Which it still was.
Yeah,
because
it still was.
I mean, they still led to a lawsuit because they tried to say that Scott Hall was portraying Razor Ramon, but he had been that kind of character for quite some time.
Yeah, the accent was there, the toothpicks. You could see elements of Razor Ramon for days. So a lawsuit would still go down. They would have had a much better case had he been wearing the gear for sure.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Next matchup was Sergeant Craig Pittman versus DDP. I mean, this wasn't anything to really write home about.
No.
DDP's fresh off the Battle Bowl win, and this is kind of the only reason why we're even stopping on this match and talking about it in any kind of length at all is because this is kind of the beginning of the build for Diamond Dallas Page to become one of WCW's marquee franchise guys. He's still a heel at this time. They're talking about the benefactor of him, who's backing him financially. They start talking about the selling the diamond cutter and how it's some kind of fantastic move that he can hit out of anywhere. The RKO has taken on a mind of its own as of late, with the RKO vines and everything. I mean, that before there were RKO vines, I mean, there was the diamond cutter. He was hitting it from anywhere, and it was especially when he made his face turn, they would flip out over the different and inventive ways that he would hit the diamond cutter. So,
yeah, I liked him a lot. I am glad that we're spending some time on this match because it is Diamond Dallas Page. He's a very well-respected guy today. Of course, his DDP yoga, it's a whole new career. I need to get my fat ass doing it too. So he's been incredibly successful with that. That he was a guy who was primarily taking on the role of anything but wrestler and here he is late. You know, he's no spring chicken right here.
Right. Yeah, he's old.
Yeah, and to have made a run at the title and to have captured it, which will obviously that's a later show, but it is something to be admired. Of course, as a kid, I just thought he was another guy on the roster, just a guy that I really liked on the roster.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I had no idea who he was. I didn't really care about him. I thought his music was cool because it was like a Nirvana knockoff, which WCW was pretty good at finding like old like grunge songs and kind of sampling them to make them like cooler wrestling songs, which I hated most of the WCW entrance themes. But Teddy Long is Craig Pittman's manager. He looked like he had been at the buffet quite some time. He's been spending some catering time. He was fatter than shit.
He was. I didn't realize that he at what point had what was kind of big like that.
And I'd forgotten. I mean, I remember him as a manager of Doom because of Ron Simmons and Butch Reed. I had like some WCW trading cards from back in the day, and he was with them. And I remembered him being there. Looking back now, it's like, wow, Teddy Long. I mean, he's playa. He's as a GM of SmackDown, and you know he's a very tiny guy now. I mean, he was a heftier fellow back in the day.
Yeah, he was. He would in that GM role would get to show a lot more of his personality and say some really funny stuff in his promos. It's something I noticed up until this point of Nitro and continuing forward. Just about everybody, either one opponent in the match or the other, would have a valet or a manager. Just about that was such a bigger deal back then. Teddy Long would go on he would have a fine career going forward. My first memory of him was when he was with Harlem Heat. That was my first. Not big on Craig Pittman. I don't know.
He was the first guy to me in this show. It was like one of the first to like string together this idea of the guys coming from the power plant. They had pushed that a lot. You know, Craig Pittman came from the power plant. Max comes from the power plant in the Luger match later. Hard Work Bobby Walker comes from the power plant. Alex Wright did some stuff in the power plant, but he's more of an international guy. You know, WCW, they pushed the power plant as like their developmental. And I remember them showing like vignettes during Nitro of like working out in the power plant, like come down the power plant and like work out and become a wrestler. And I was like, man, that seems kind of cool. But then I went to college, so.
No, I've seen here in town. I'm in Atlanta now, and I saw a UFC gym once. I thought, how cool would it be?
Oh yeah,
if there was a wrestling gym. What a really awesome bone crushing way to like try to get in shape.
Well, I think that they're kind of going that avenue with not like to where it's just like a wrestling themed gym. They're going to have like the tap out gyms. Tap Out is joining with WWE, and they're going to have like tap out gyms. So under that umbrella.
Well, good. They need to stick one up Sandy Springs way.
Yeah. So up next, the Giant and the Shark. Of course, the Shark. If you are a younger fan like us, you remember him as Earthquake. Fresh off getting the boot from the Dungeon of Doom. The Shark it's a very interesting gimmick to me, and it just kind of shows like how WCW at this point it kind of had a identity crisis because it had these kind of cartoonish type characters like WWE had or WWF at the time. And it also had the realistic type angles within it. You know, if you look at the Horsemen, Mongo McMichael, Kevin Green angle, that's pretty realistic. You know, it's talking about Deborah being involved with Flair and then bringing in the idea that Macho and Flair and Elizabeth and that love triangle. I mean, that's kind of higher level, you know, cheating on wives. You don't really understand, like, cheating on your wife and adultery at 11 or from like 8 to 10 if you're a kid, but you understand this fat guy that used to be Earthquake coming out dressed as a shark and had painted up painted teeth on his face and whatnot.
Oh, that was one of the worst face paint jobs I'd seen.
Ever.
Oh my God.
And they said he's from Tsunami. Like, that's a place. Like, couldn't go parts unknown. He's from an actual, like, natural disaster. Like, there's a tsunami and
oh God.
The shark, this giant fat guy has the athletic ability to, like, ride on a tsunami.
That's funny stuff. Of course, it's John Tenta. He, like you say, he would be Earthquake before all this. So they just pick another object or a thing for him to be.
Oh yeah, I mean he's the Shark. Which I mean it's like predates Shark Boy from TNA. Like, I mean sharks are they're menacing animals, obviously, but I just never. And Giants putting the world title on the line against this guy to start hour 2, which I thought was kind of odd.
Right.
As a kid, I don't ever remember thinking that Shark or John Tenta or Golga, as he would later be in WWF, I just never thought him to be credible after he was squashed in like the early 90s as Earthquake.
Right, and I also, while I didn't know anything as a kid of booking or anything of this nature, I wouldn't have, as the 10-year-old I was, watched this match at the top of hour number 2 and gone, wow, Shark's a real threat to this world title that Giant's carrying. No way.
Right. Could you imagine a guy with that shitty of face paint holding the world title?
Could they have given the man a mirror backstage? I feel like he just kind of like haphazardly slathered that shit on his face. Didn't have a mirror. He couldn't get like Miss Elizabeth or Woman or some artistic lady backstage and say, will you do this for me? Here's what I'm going for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Dungeon of Doom was kind of a campy idea anyway.
But I loved it. I like it. You know me, I like my dark gimmicks, Undertaker being my favorite of all time, and the Wyatt family being a group of guys that by and large I really respect a lot, and that kind of, you know how hard that kind of gimmick pops me.
Yeah.
And I like the presentation of Dungeon of Doom. They all had the same entrance music. The lights would go out. It would get all dark. Which they didn't do. They didn't do for very many guys in WCW. Not a lot of creative pyrotechnics, not a lot of creative light work, but they would have that with Dungeon of Doom. Something that I noticed about this match that I made note of. Here you have John Tenta, a man of the past. I did not look up what year that he would pass on. Giant was a young guy in great shape and just really starting his career, holding the world title. It was something of and I don't know if John Tenta thought of it this way as kind of putting Giant over in a sense, but you had a guy from the past, big man of the past versus big man of the future, and of course Big Show is a guy who still has a career today. I found that to be this interesting passing of the torch kind of moment as it relates to big men in wrestling.
Yeah, I see. For me, I had a different perspective. I didn't really think it was more of a passing of the torch. I thought it was just that John Tenta had become, or the Shark had become, enhancement talent. I didn't really view him as like I mean, I guess he wasn't like a jobber at this point because he had a storyline where he was feuding with Bubba and the Dungeon of Doom and those guys there. But what I thought was really, really interesting is how small and athletic the Giant was at this time compared to what he later became in WWF, and he never was like as small and athletic.
I took note of the same thing. I thought, I just thought he was a pretty good looking guy. Like not with the hair, and he's young, he's in good shape, pretty athletic. I mean, even in the early stages of his career in WWF under the name Big Show, he could work a little bit. I loved his tag title run he had with Jericho there in 2009, that period of time when I was able to watch them at SummerSlam in Los Angeles that time. But so I loved, in terms of just the work in the ring, Giant body slammed Shark like he was a
easily
sack of potatoes. I mean, I thought it was beautifully done. Like I damn near found it.
Well, I mean, because the Shark was well over 500 pounds, and they just kind of, like you said, like a sack of potatoes. It was a very easily done maneuver for
He didn't
him.
even strain.
No, not at all. And John Tenta's weight didn't go up, sequentially like when Hogan talks about slamming Andre. Andre's like 900 pounds at this point, and
wasn't even that good of a body slam either. I saw some old footage of Kamala put a body slam on Andre that the one Hogan did on Andre in WrestleMania 3 didn't hold a candle to.
No, not at all. I mean, and for me, and going back and looking at this in a retrospective light, WCW had kind of yo-yoed the Giant a bit. He comes in, wins the world title, and then he loses to Hogan because everybody loses to Hogan.
Right.
Especially at WCW when he had creative control. But this is a way to kind of rebuild the Giant into this psycho monster. And they're pushing him, going to be fighting Luger at Great American Bash. And then we see Big Bubba, formerly the Big Boss Man, comes in, cuts and shaves half of the Shark's head, which would lead to, next week.
I took note of that as well. It's like, what a humiliating act. I mean, they don't shave a lot of heads on live TV these days, I don't feel like.
No, and it's always been a big thing in wrestling, is something they build to. And that's kind of what the announcers pushed, that, it was a very, very demeaning thing. And, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next episode where we look at the June 2nd Nitro. But, yeah, it was a big thing. I don't really think it came off as a huge deal, but, looking back as a wrestling fan, it's a very, very big. I mean, the hair versus hair, it was one of the big selling points of a WrestleMania.
Yeah.
With Trump and McMahon. Now, the next two matches.
Well, before we get into the next match.
Okay.
But between when Bubba is shaving off half of Shark's head and the Lord Steven Regal versus Alex Wright match, we get those of you out there that have the network and are able to watch it like we are, we get a WCW magazine commercial where this little kid has the magazine and all of a sudden he turns into Sting.
The Sting, yeah.
Yeah, and then it goes back to being the kid. I used to love to get my paws on a good wrestling magazine every now and then. And the commercials like this used to pop me huge because it would make me want one that much more.
You go to the grocery store and go through the magazine section and see, you talk your parents into it, put it in the buggy to where, if they don't say anything, it's awesome. Yeah.
It's kayfabe as hell, too. You don't get any insight with those magazines. And I remember the last time I bought a magazine like that, I was connecting on a flight from Los Angeles to come back to Birmingham, and I think I was connecting maybe in Dallas or somewhere. And I needed just some boredom material. I wanted to read something, so I scooped up a WWF magazine, and I'm trying to, enjoy it, but it's just so. I mean, they're just kind of going along with storyline and superstar this and superstar that and lame shit. Yeah, so.
Oh yeah.
I made note of that commercial, and we would see it a few more times. Not this episode, but the next of Nitro.
Right.
Now we can talk about Lord Steven Regal and how badass he is.
Well, the two matches that you can kind of skip, got Max, formerly Max Muscle, Lex Luger and Max. This match was not very good. It was just kind of showing us that Luger could put a bigger gentleman in the torture rack, pushing Luger the Giant. Giant choke slammed Luger through a table 2 weeks ago. Luger is able to put Max, who's 6'4", 330, in the torture rack. So it's just kind of showing that he can put Max in the torture rack and saying, kind of teasing, will he be able to get the Giant in the torture rack? Yeah. Next match was Hard Work Bobby Walker, Brad Armstrong. Brad Armstrong, a great kind of carpenter in the ring. Walker, as I mentioned earlier in the show, power plant guy. Armstrong obviously supposed to help Hard Walk Bobby Walker get better in the ring. And I don't really think I ever saw Hard Work Bobby Walker ever. I saw this guy, and I was like, who the hell is this guy? But Walker tried to do some interesting things within the match, but good God, he blew some spots pretty badly. He fell on the ring ropes at least twice. So if you've got some time to kill and you're watching this, this might be worth going to see, and just to see, and you can kind of see his face. He's really excited at the very beginning of the match, and at the end he's kind of dejected because he'd just blown some spots pretty badly.
Watched these, but like I was in McElroy land for a good portion of it.
Right.
All I have in my notes is hard work wins. And when I was going over my note, I was like, wait, hard work wins. Is this some kind of like fortune cookie I just wrote to myself?
Or some kind of motivational speech.
Yeah.
Like a motivational poster in the weight room in high school.
My first podcast in 6 years. Hard work wins, Rob. You'll be all right. But no, I went and hung out in McElroy land. McElroy land is a place I go to that Charles made up, this fictional place when I zone out, and it's ADD City Johnson. So McElroy land is a place I'll go to from time to time, especially watching.
Up next, Lord Steven Regal and Alex Wright. This is pre Alex Wright, Das Wunderkind with the dancing, and love watching William Regal, Steven Regal wrestle. Love watching him work in the match. You know, you got to think that Regal was working to get Alex Wright better. One thing I wanted to point out, besides, you know, the fact that William Regal's awesome at everything that he does in wrestling, is that if you look at this match, the fans were not into this at all. When the 3 count happens, it's as if, a fart had happened in church. Like, no one looks excited about anything. Like, no one's standing, cheering, anything. It's like 1, 2, 3, and everybody's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a sudden finish, but in spite of that, yeah, no one seemed to be into it at all. I, for one, was absolutely just loving what I was seeing, and I wish as a kid I could have appreciated how awesome Steven Regal is. I wish I could have appreciated as a kid how great Steven Regal was in the ring. I hated him as a kid, personally.
Oh, yeah, he was a great heel.
It was a great heel. And I, as a kid, what's changed to me, a lot of things have changed about me as a wrestling fan, from a wrestling fan as a child to a wrestling fan now as an adult. Now as an adult, I can appreciate a great heel and a fine worker and all this. But as a kid, I very well stuck to the rule of thumb: pull for the good guy, pull against the bad guy. Right. It seemed logical to me that in the film and TV that I watched, that I would obviously pull for the good and want poetic justice to happen. And it really was no different in wrestling. But loved the psychology from Regal, watching it now as an adult who can appreciate a fine heel. Right. His promos, fantastic. They do a spot with Gene afterwards, you know, with calling people peasants and that sort of thing. He called, I think he called Mean Gene Okerlund a toad. Thought that was fantastic. But I love Zbyszko's. No, it wasn't. It was Heenan at this point. Heenan, they're looking at the tape to look at that really fast finish, and Heenan's all like, Alex Wright is a poor competitor, but his whole family is uglier than him. Which was brilliant. That was gold. He would have so many of those during his amazing career.
Heenan's good stuff.
Another thing, as a kid, I didn't know how to appreciate him. I liked Heenan for what I knew him to be. But that kind of sense of humor, I didn't know anything about it. I had a different kind of sense of humor as a guy that had been on Earth for a total of 10 years. Right. Watching that as an adult now, I popped so huge. That's the Heenan quote of the day. Heenan, we should have one every day.
Right. Another thing I wanted to talk about, mid-match, we get a commercial break, and, you know, from time to time on the network, they'll show you what the commercials were, and it's not like product placement. It's like, like Robert mentioned with the WCW magazine. This one was a tease for Glacier.
Yeah.
Which is a theme that we'll see throughout Nitro, is building to his debut. And it struck me as so like Mortal Kombat-esque now, and I don't really think that I picked that up that much back then, because I wasn't a Mortal Kombat guy. I had Super Nintendo, so I was a Street Fighter guy. So I didn't really know a ton about Mortal Kombat. And I remember Mortal Kombat being like a very like ultra big deal around our parts, I guess. I don't know if it was a nationally, the violence and the blood and the killing in Mortal Kombat was like a big deal. I mean, my parents didn't care, but, and I didn't have a Sega anyway, but, because Mortal Kombat was a Sega game at the time. So I didn't have that Mortal Kombat, but I mean, you could play it at like Pizza Hut and shit after baseball. But
yeah, my folks wouldn't allow me to play it, and I agree that that package, just the TV package alone, is very Mortal Kombat-esque. And what's interesting about WCW did not have to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to character development, because a lot of these guys, we've discussed many of them already, came in already as seasoned veterans. They already came in with their gimmick. Shark, Hulk Hogan, Macho Man. Guys that people already knew what they were about. Even Scott Hall with his appearance, people already knew him as Razor Ramon. Well, here's WCW trying to groom and come up with a character that is uniquely theirs. This is not a WWF molded, shaped star. WCW would only do this. I mean, they didn't do it a whole lot. They would do it with Goldberg much later. But this is kind of their first crack at that, wouldn't you say? Or one of their first really an important cracks at that.
Yeah, it definitely was. And it kind of feeds into what we talked about, the 50% of the characters on WCW, like half of them were more reality-based and the other half were kind of cartoony. And Glacier, to me, seemed like he was trending more toward the cartoon side of things.
Kind of. I mean, there are aspects of that character,
I don't want to get too far into him because we've got so many of these teasers that are going to happen throughout. I mean, it doesn't debut until September and it's May, so
right. We'll see more. We'll see more and more of it. I agree. I mean, I do. I felt like at the time it was sort of Mortal Kombat-esque. I still agree that it is.
The main event: Scott Steiner versus Sting. Please tell me that you listened to the WCW-tastic ring entrance themes, especially the Steiners. Steiner line!
What confused
they
me
sounded
is that
almost the same. The Steiners and the Sting.
The exact same. Oh my God, I thought, did they just shaft Steiner with not giving him music and just like let Sting keep playing? I thought, what a dick move. Give the man music. No. He's a Steiner brother and already had a career going into y'all's organization. Give the man some damn music. Little did I. Yeah, so he had music the whole damn time.
If you listen to the words of the Steiner line song, it is so like late 80s, early 90s tastic. It's just, it's awful. Yeah, YouTube that, and it's terrible. I mean, this was part of the reason that I really didn't like a lot of the WCW entrance themes. I was a big fan of the WWF entrance themes. I mean, loved Jake the Snakes. I've loved the original Hogan from WWF, Ultimate Warrior. I love the guitar riffs in those. But the Steiners and Sting, this is crap theme music. The Sting with a man called Sting. That's terrible. Terrible.
Yeah, well, too many of them sounded the same. There were some that I liked a lot, but I'm not as passionate about my hatred toward it as you. I'm just kind of like, my mindset of it, some are bad, some were good, but the WWF absolutely did a much better job with everybody's entrance music. What else about this match?
Well, I mean, it's just your usual big man match. I mean, Steiner and Sting had, they'd been in WCW for quite some time. The Steiners had a cup of coffee in WWF, and then they come back. This was just a backdrop to set up a big tag match for next week with Luger and Sting versus Steiner brothers. Ends in a brawl because, Sting, in a very uncomfortable-looking spot, suplexes Scott Steiner to the floor, and Scott kind of squats and then grabs Sting, and he's going to suplex him on the floor on the pads that are just covering the concrete, and Luger kicks him in the stomach, and then melee ensues. So, to me, the show kind of went down a hill from, you had the opener with the Horsemen and the American Males, a pretty decent match. And not saying that the Regal Alex Wright wasn't a good match, but you just didn't have hot characters there. And the Steiner Sting, to me, was very indicative of the main event guys just kind of going through the motions and not having great finishes.
Yeah, I thought that the show overall was a good show. We have some big-time history take place very early in it. It's better than anything I see these days,
right.
Just about, excluding, I'm not talking about the likes of NXT, ROH,
right.
Things of this nature. But I'll take what I saw over a lot of things I've seen the last 6-7 years. I absolutely would. And I thought the match itself, this main event, was okay. I love the typical WCW ringing of the bells. When all hell breaks loose, they're ding 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 ding, and there's still
right.
people coming into the ring, still this chaos, more ding 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 ding. I like that. It sells to the fans that we're trying to get them to stop this mess. The signaling of the bells they need to either begin or quit. In this case, it's obviously to quit. We're still
right.
ringing. They won't stop. Kayfabe, we've lost. It's not really a thing anymore. But there were things that little things like that. The selling the product.
And then Scott Hall comes
little
back
things.
out, which was kind of sent the trajectory of the show back up for me. Comes back out and confronts Bischoff, tells him that, he'll be back more in the invasion angle. I think that it sold the fact that, this wasn't when Bischoff talks in his book and he talks in the Monday Night War DVD, part of what WCW wanted to do with this is, have that run-of-the-mill wrestling product to where I know that all this is predetermined, but that wasn't supposed to happen. And that's another thing with Scott Hall coming out here. It just kind of speaks to the fact that he said that early in the show he was going to confront the Ken doll. He was talking about Bischoff, and, Bischoff makes some snide comments, and, he looks terrified. He does a good job of looking terrified in this situation, to kind of sell the fact that he's scared because Scott Hall's way bigger than him and that kind of thing.
What you have happening here is a perfect storm of a situation where Ted Turner, $1 billion Ted, as Scott Hall calls him, has all the money in the world to be able to finance this side project of his called wrestling, called specifically World Championship Wrestling. He's able to, if you have Ted Turner's money to bankroll an organization, you're going to get the best money can buy. And the best at the time money could buy was Hogan, eventually Kevin Nash, Scott Hall. They had acquired Macho Man, all these talents. So you have that working for you. And then you have a young, confident, good-looking fella in Eric Bischoff who knows how to book. And this perfect storm, this is the beginning of it.
Yeah, they caught lightning in a bottle with the NWO. We'll talk. That'll be kind of our underlying theme throughout the Nitro era is how WCW booked the NWO and how it was the main thing going throughout those years. Pretty decent show, will forever be in the annals of history because of Scott Hall showing up and the advent of the NWO era of WCW and kind of the advent of that Attitude Era television to where, you know, hey, all this wrestling stuff's great, but holy shit, that wasn't supposed to happen. Or, you know, that water cooler type talk that you know, so many people are involved in today, you know, wanting to watch the Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, Breaking Bad when it comes out initially so that they can participate in that discussion at work or school or whatever the next day, or, you know, participate in the discussion on social media. And that's kind of where that idea originated, I think. I mean, this like era of wrestling predates all that water cooler talk, I think. I mean, it made you have to watch wrestling live because you didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah. And, you know, these days we live in such an instant gratification society in just about every aspect. And here we are with a build to a major life-altering, history-changing storyline, and we're getting one character at a time.
Oh, yeah. And they did a good job with the slow build.
Yes.
With this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, do you have anything else for this, the May 27th, 1996 episode? Do you have any closing thoughts?
Just that everyone should shoot us a follow on social media if they want to. I can be found on Twitter at twitter.com at being_large. Same thing as Instagram.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, NoBozos2. You know, make sure that you check out other things on pwinsiderelite.com. If you're listening to this, you're already elite, so you know how awesome the job that the guys over at PW Insider do. Mike's always breaking news. Dave and Mike Epson-Hart on the mailbag. Richard Triunfo, Paul Crockett, Stu. The guys do a great job with the audio offerings that they have, the coverage of the pay-per-views. If you're a lapsed fan, if you're a retrospective fan, that you enjoy what we're talking about here, these guys take that kind of look at everything that goes on in the wrestling business. You don't have to watch the product now. You can find something that you can enjoy about wrestling. And if you do the year subscription, it is, it's like pennies on the dot. It's less than a Netflix, less than the network. It's like $5, $6.99, $7.99 at most. I mean, it's the best $8 you'll spend if you're an actual wrestling fan, with the just sheer amount of information about wrestling and that tickles the itch of the wrestling fan, whatever kind of wrestling fan you are. Even if you don't like the WWE product anymore, you can still find stuff to go through. They have the old lariats that you can read through. Everything's searchable now. Audio interviews with wrestlers from tons of different eras. If you're a big ROH fan, they cover ROH. So if you're listening on SoundCloud and YouTube, make sure you check out PW Insider. And if you're listening on PWInsiderElite.com, I am an Elite subscriber just like you are. I love it. And best money I spent on wrestling the last 11 years. And I really appreciate Dave giving us the opportunity to have an avenue to reach the amount of people that we can through that website. All right, that's going to do it for the May 27th, 1996 episode of Nitro. You can click the next link, and we're going to be talking about June 2nd, 1996, and we'll continue on. We're going to separate them by shows so that you'll have corresponding audio for each episode of Nitro, including the Great American Bash. For Robert McElroy, this has been Charlie Dudley, and you have been listening to At a Combined Weight.